Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session, which is discussing Africa's food paradox. As you know, Africa spends more than $35 billion importing food per annum, and this actually excludes fish. By 2025, we expect this figure to grow to $110 billion. This money could actually be used for other things, such as creating jobs, local production, improving lives, basically. With the population in Africa due to grow quite dramatically over the next few years, we really need to be finding solutions to solve this issue about food importation. How do we make Africa more self-sufficient in terms of producing food for its people? Today I have a distinguished panel, a lot of experience on this panel to discuss this question. On my left-hand side, I have Mr. Adade from Royal Dutch DSM, DSM.
Good morning.
Mamadou Biteye from the Rockefeller Foundation in Kenya.
Good morning.
Briju Patel from ETG, Export Trading Group.
Good morning.
And William Asiko from Grow Africa.
Good morning.
So we actually were going to be joined. I know there's always an issue about gender balance. We were going to be joined by Benedicte from Congo, and unfortunately she was not able to be with us today. She's a global shaper as well as a young producer, so we're quite saddened that she was not going to be here. So I think to get the ball rolling, I actually wanted to ask Mamadou, the issue about contract farming is not new to Africa. It has been around, actually to the world. It's been something which has been talked about. But what are the issues? Why are we not getting it right in Africa?
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that first and foremost to say that contract farming is really very important because it provides particularly smallholder farmers who constitute the majority of farmers in Africa with access to reliable markets for their produce. And contract farming also, for it to work, it really has to be based on mutual trust. And so far, that has been a challenge. And this is something we specifically see and experience within the initiative that the Rockefeller Foundation has launched last year, yield-wise around the reduction of post-harvest loss, which actually has the goal of reducing post-harvest loss by 50% through really restoring the broken linkages to markets, aggregating and also training farmers so that they can meet quality requirements of buyers, but also volume requirements of buyers, which is very important, and obviously put in their hands simple, affordable, but effective technologies to reducing post-harvest loss, but and also financing. But one of the things that we see is, first of all, it's oftentimes very difficult to get purchase commitments actually translated into contracts, particularly when you're talking about corporate buyers who actually monitor market pricing because they buy from several places and oftentimes are not able to commit to prices, fixed prices actually early in the contract. There are also issues related because of that lack of contract, formal with terms agreed before, oftentimes, and in some value chains, actually there is always non-observation of the commitments that the parties make. We see that from the buyer's side. We see that also from the farmer's side. Sometimes, because the market conditions changes, corporates who have committed volume do not get to buy that volume, leaving farmers with the surplus production they don't know what to do with, or they are obliged to dispose at largely discounted prices.
So if I can, sorry to interrupt you there. On that point, I was going to ask William actually to come in on this. I mean, this then doesn't actually encourage farmers to diversify. They tend to then stick into areas in which they're more comfortable, in such as growing maize, and does not, because of the fear or the lack of trust that Mamadou has talked about. I mean, how then do we get governments then to encourage a diversification and a move away from a monocrop type of environment then, with this background?
Thank you, Monica. Look, I think that farmers, like any other entrepreneurs, react to market conditions. And you will find that if there is a surplus in production in one season of a particular crop, and naturally the price would drop, depending on weather conditions, some farmers would change to another crop. There are so many dynamics that feed into this. But let's not forget, at the end of the day, contract farming can be a disruption of the market, because a price is fixed ahead of time, and depending on a number of things, including weather, or including all sorts of things that affect production, the market can shift. And it becomes very difficult for the contractor to enforce the contract, particularly when prices go up. Smallholder farmers are very smart. They're very happy to stick with you when the price is down, and you, as the contractor, had offered a higher price. But when the price in the market is higher, the whole issue of side selling begins. And it becomes very difficult. And, throw in all the issues that we have in many countries in Africa around contract enforcement, around enabling environment, it becomes very difficult to enforce these contracts. So I think contract farming is, to me, it's a process. It's more than a contract. It's working with farmers over time. I know that there are a number of aggregators, including my friend Birju here from ETG, that work with farmers over a long period of time to build that trust, as Mamadou was saying. You really have to build that trust so that the farmers can feel an obligation towards you, even when the market shifts. I think that's really the only way to do it.
Sure. And actually, moving on to Birju, the two things we've discovered. So farming in Africa is expensive. Inputs are expensive. I mean, coming from ETG, a very successful business across the continent, how is it that you've done so well? What can you tell our audience today about your successes and some of the challenges you've experienced, and what you're doing to work with the public sector as well as the farmers to ensure you overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. From an ETG perspective, our greatest strength has always been our proximity to the farmers. We've always been building assets and infrastructure right at the farmer's footstep. And I think that's probably where our success has been different from everybody else that's trying the same models in Africa. Along with that, you have to build a very patient model. And I think William believes in this quite extensively now. What I mean by proximity to farmer, we have built infrastructure to manage post-harvest losses, to manage harvest losses, to process the commodity from the farmer such that the farmer gets the right pricing, and all this at his footstep. So he has to just deliver it across from his farm to an ETG depot. ETG will collect it. And this has been a model that we've built over the last 15 to 20 years. So it's not been something that's happened overnight or in a period of 5 years. It's taken us a lot of pain, a lot of challenges. Firstly, you have to earn the trust of the farmer. Secondly, you have to manage this issue of side selling. And thirdly, you have to build a value chain such that his product can end up to the right consumer at the right price for the farmer. And this whole process requires a lot of patience. It has, so coming back to the challenges part of building this value chain, we have probably paid 10 years of school fees and are probably reaping the rewards of that right now, right? You have to build that first fundamental layer of trust with the small-scale farmer. The second and most important challenge we feel that we're facing presently is that the average age of small-scale farmers in Africa is between 60 to 65 years.
Oh, really?
That's a retirement age for everyone in this room, right? Now, how do you engage the youth to get involved in farming? So that's a big challenge for us now. How do you transition from the head of the family to the next generation? And obviously moving ahead with how the rest of the world is progressing, we feel technology is going to play a big part in that. And ETG is investing quite heavily in ag tech, along with many other players from the international markets.
So Bridget, I'm going to come back on that bit about technology because I think it's an important question, but I just want to get Mauricio in here, just to hold that thought. Yep. Mauricio comes from Royal DSM. I've done a great investment in Rwanda. I would love for you to tell our audience about what you've done and what went into actually creating this literally local production in Rwanda.
Thank you, Monica. We have been talking about farming, but I'd like to start in mentioning the size of the problem that we are discussing here. By the end of the day today of this beautiful discussion we will have during the day, more than 10,000 mothers will see their babies dying because of malnutrition. So this means 3.1 million children will die because of problems with nutrition. The good news is that this is solvable, but there is something that cannot be solved by just one part of the society. We need to have the private industry, governments, and also the social society working together into that. We do believe at DSM that a good quality nutrition is really a basic human right. And to go to your question, we have been invited by the government of Rwanda in order to create a full-fledged ecosystem, a new business model that goes from the farming that have been discussing here up to the consumers and giving the adequate nutrition, not only in terms of protein and energy, but also the micronutrients. So from that perspective, together with partners, World Bank, the Development Bank of UK, and also Development Bank of the Netherlands, and with the support of the Clinton Health Initiative, we have started a venture in Rwanda where we are starting from the beginning, and having a discussion with the farmers. We have 9,000 smallhold farmers where we are addressing and making more predictable what is the use of their crops and use that as a raw material for fortified cereals that will be serving pregnant and lactating women, as well small children, toddlers, and older children. So with that, we are making the overall economic wheel in Rwanda work. And this is about, as I said before, the whole ecosystem is from end to end, and more important, is local for local. Now, what we're producing there is a very high quality product. A lot of innovation went into that. And then this is really something that can be, of course, sold in Rwanda, but in the region, and more than that, it can be exported because the quality that we are doing there is something that is a global standard. Mm-hmm. So in this direction, we truly believe that together, and this system is, number one, scalable, and number two, is also replicable. As much as we learn how to make this overall system and new business model work, we can reinvest everything that's coming from the profit in new facilities around the region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to throw this question out to anyone on the panel. Yesterday there was a discussion about how do we make these small-scale farmers into large-scale farmers? I mean, is it possible, practical? I think the issue, again, is we're hearing the same word, scale. Scale, scale, scale. Would anyone want to try and attempt that? How are we going to change that? How do we grow our small-scale farmers?
Thank you, Monica. You know, I think the question is really more about transforming a subsistence farmer from pure subsistence to a more commercial-minded operation. And if you do that successfully, I think transitioning from small scale to larger scale, maybe not necessarily large scale, but larger scale, will be a natural transition. Look, I come from Kenya. Kenya is a story of smallholder commercial farmers, mostly farmers that have less than 2 hectares, but it's all commercial. It's all horticulture, it's cash crops run on a cooperative system. Kenya's entire dairy industry is built on smallholders and built by cooperatives. So I think, to me, the more important discussion is how do we turn a subsistence minded farmer to a commercially minded farmer. And I think that there's been a lot of work done on that. I think there's a lot of focus on trying to support commercial farming on a large scale. I think enabling policies around supporting smallholder commercial farmers has got much more benefit for countries. Certainly it has worked in East Africa, where you have a lot of subsistence farming, and you're now producing surplus with all the work that's been done on productivity. It's about making sure that the cooperative system is working well so that farmers can aggregate their produce, get a better price at the market, and then working with processors and making sure that the policies are in place for them to invest and work with these farmers.
Great. And 2 other themes, youth and innovation. Do you think, or do we think, the new innovations in agriculture will actually attract the youth? Did you want to attempt that?
Yeah. So just as a starting point, right? I think there's a stigma attached to the term small-scale farmer. Many people consider that to be the poorest of the poor in Africa, and the youth also see that in their mindset. So now it's all about having this extreme shift in changing that perception. So how do we go about with that? And I think that's a very difficult prospect, a very difficult answer. I think we've been debating this for months on end, years on end, and we struggle ourselves to find solutions to invigorate, to encourage new farmers to come in to the marketplace. What we have sort of embarked upon in recent times is looking at farmers as entrepreneurs. And I think a term was coined out yesterday. Somebody mentioned a word called agripreneurs. And I think that's the term we need to start moving forward and focusing on. We need to change, perhaps, using the term small scale and focusing more on agripreneurship, right? And how do we go about with that? So the starting point is private sector looking at forming some structures to allow these guys to have access to finance, cheap finance, and insurance, right? I think the cooperatives do it really well in Kenya, and probably one of the most successful stories that we have seen are in Kenya. We haven't seen it anywhere across the rest of the regions. Perhaps in certain specific products like cocoa, tea, etc., cocoa in West Africa, those models are working. What we are now, or what we think may change the perception, is to create more price transparency through phone and mobile utilization. So not just using apps, because not every small-scale farmer has the ability to use a smartphone. They still have the traditional Nokias or the old-school phones. So there are technologies that are being developed around USSD platforms or straight messaging services, and giving them transparency around pricing, and building technology around just pure understanding to where their product will end up. I think that's probably the starting point for this. Along with that, it's important that we try and find a mechanism to provide them with finance and products that can allow them to become more corporatized.
Great. And Mamadou, on this one, I would really be keen or interested to know what YieldWise is actually doing. Are you also collecting data? Do we understand really how much farmers are growing, where they're growing it, harvest times and things like that, which is really important information for local producers at the end of the value chain who want to know when the quality, quantities, how far from storage, things like of that nature?
Absolutely. Data and information is really key, particularly to the aspects that YieldWise is focusing in, particularly the market. Being able to understand and have a traceability of the product, being able to understand and predict the volumes of production, where they are coming from, by whom, etc. All of that data, and being able to understand what are the projected needs of the market, for which type of crops, etc. All of that are information that is very important. So this is why we see really a lot of information asymmetry, but also incomplete information that skews that. So one of the things that at YieldWise we're trying to do is also providing that information, availing the information for the actors. And for that we work with different partners to try to use advanced technology, particularly satellite imagery, to be able to look at, have information about crops, how they are evolving, what would be the output. The other thing is also really our ambition is really working in digitizing information in the value chains, so that consistent, reliable data can be availed to all actors in the value chain to be able to guide the decisions they make. And I think that is not just around that, but it's really around the whole agricultural sector where we need that. Unfortunately, agriculture also is a sector where we make a lot of decisions with very little data. This is also the capability, I think, also to analyze data once it is available needs to be developed across the actors also in the value chain. So availability of it, capability to analyze it, to make sense of it, and to inform those business decisions that are being made, even with the agripreneurs, as you want to call them.
Exactly. I definitely agree with that, definitely. And lastly, Mauricio, I think we'll be really interested to know some of the challenges on the downstream end around food safety and security. I think it's one thing to produce food in our countries, but is it of the right standard? Are we able then to export it to our neighboring countries? What are the challenges with that, and also exporting internationally?
Well, I can't describe challenges here from the whole session, and I don't think that you are so much into it. I'll try to focus in the main challenge that we have been facing. Again, you can talk about food security, but processing is one part. But I have to come back to what my colleagues have said. I mean, the raw material is one of the most important side. And for the raw material, depending which country you're talking in the continent, technology is a must. So in order to bring innovation, in order to understand how to tackle the challenges, the weather challenges, I mean, what kind of quality of the crops. So technology is quite important. And I think if we don't have a raw material that has a high quality, it will be very difficult from a processing point of view to end up with a high quality end product. In our case, I mean, the fortified cereals. So from that perspective, one of the biggest challenges is that making sure that we have the adequate quality in regards of everything that is needed, including one of the big topics that we have in this region, aflatoxin for corn. So I think, I mean, we need to work harder into that in order to develop the right technologies to get the right quality of crops. And to your previous question, I think if you look around and try to get some experience that we have had in the South Hemisphere, like the countries like Brazil, it's not too much about the size of the farmers. It's more about the technology they have access, and number two, how they cooperate together. So the cooperatives, they are very important. The way you organize them in order to give these farmers the possibility of having the adequate and the sustainable technology, but also that they have a place where they can sell their crops.
That's excellent, excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it for yourselves. I think there are a number of really interesting issues which have come up. Youth technology, innovation, local production as well. I think we'd like to give an opportunity to a few of you to ask questions to the panel. I don't know if there's some mics. And if you just introduce yourself and let us know where you're coming from.
Hi, my name is Tim Cohen. I'm the editor of Business Day, which is a daily newspaper here in South Africa. I just wanted to ask about ownership rights, land ownership. How much of a problem is this? How much would you encourage? It seems to me the large parts of Africa have essentially state-owned land systems rather than farmer-owned land systems. And there doesn't seem to be any impetus to change that. I was wondering why that was, and whether you would agree that a farmer-owned land system is preferable, and if not, why not?
Gentlemen.
Yeah, let me share my perspective on this. I think this is a real problem, and sometimes in many countries also it is a very sensitive question around the land, which actually makes really the land tenure system not being reformed in a way that would be conducive for increased investment in the agriculture. I think that really land titling, identification of land, and titling so that everyone has ownership on this, like it was done in Rwanda, can really open up many opportunities. First of all, it allows really to be able to collateralize, to access financing, to access technology, etc. But also to the question that you asked, should also smallholder farms become a little bit larger? Because with titling also, this will actually enable also probably what we could call mergers and acquisitions. So some farms may absorb others and also give an opportunity for farmers to transform into other type of actually agricultural trades. So I think that it is part of the, it is an enabler that actually could be leveraged and addressed by policies. Yeah.
Thank you. I think those.
Hello, my name is Christy Peacock, and I founded a company in Kenya called Biteye, which is now the biggest distribution network of agricultural inputs. I have 2 points to make. One is about a yield gap, and the other is about the quality of agricultural inputs. The first point is that we still have huge issues with the yield gap between the actual and the potential across Africa. The smallholder dairy sector was mentioned earlier, and there you see dairy cows producing an average of 5 litres a day with a genetic potential to produce 15. We still have a huge gap. The building blocks of meeting that gap are agricultural inputs and knowledge, and we still have a huge problem here. We work intimately in the agricultural input sector in Kenya. We know that 60% of the agricultural inputs in Kenya are substandard. They are either counterfeit, small number, adulterated, small number, or just poorly manufactured. This means that farmers are wasting a lot of money. Of course, agricultural inputs in some cases are expensive, but it's particularly expensive when you're wasting money on a lot of rubbish. 85% of the people who sell these products in Kenya are totally unqualified. So people are selling antibiotics, agrochemicals across the counter like they're selling sugar and salt. My solution, I think, is to educate farmers and to improve regulation. And I would be very interested in hearing from the panel about other solutions to what I see as a very fundamental problem to the building blocks of improving agriculture in Africa.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think perhaps if I can jump in there. So absolutely, that's a significant concern, and it's not just a concern in Kenya, it's across the entire continent, right? What we have observed is many farmers don't have access to the basic ingredients for the right inputs. So the right seeds, the right agrochemicals, the right fertilizer. They have to reuse their previous harvested products as seed inputs. I think the statistic we came up with at ETG was 20% of farmers in Africa are using the right seed and agri-input structures for them to at least have better yields across the board. The solution is always around education and training, and what we believe in and what we've embarked upon is we've created a network of agronomists who are localized specialists. Firstly, you have to understand the culture. They have to adapt to the local requirements of each jurisdiction. And these agronomists have to go into the field and start training the people in terms of how to use, what seeds to buy as a starting point. Secondly, what agrochemicals and what fertilizer requirements and nutrients they should utilize for each product. And this is an investment. It's a significant cost that we have to take up. But again, it's part and parcel of us entrenching ourselves with the farmers. And for me, I think that's probably the foremost solution and perhaps the only solution for this specific issue for us to deal with.
Let me bring just a perspective on this question, and I think that what we said about agricultural inputs is right. But I think that this is not observable only in the agricultural sector. It's in many sectors, whereby actually suppliers sometimes adjust to the purchasing power of people. What they can afford may not be the highest quality. Even if you have resources to buy best quality, sometimes you don't have that quality on the market. So I think that one of the things that is really important is finding ways in which actually the income can be important to allow really give strong enough purchasing power to invest in quality inputs. And this will be important by not just focusing on the production side, but it's also focusing on the post-production side. You're right, the yield gap is important and is important to address, but it is also very important that despite that, we still continue to have huge losses, about 30% across, which actually significantly impacts income and capacity actually to invest in high quality, high yield inputs. And I think this is really something that should not be looked at from one side, but is really looked at through the entire value chain, maybe one of the ways to approach this.
If I may just briefly, it's I think demand plays an important role there as well. The more quality that is needed from a demand point of view, it will force the value chain to look into that. Yes. So as I was saying before, we cannot start and talk about a food security and food quality with a low quality input. So from that perspective, once the demand within the continent, demand for the people that are using not only the crops as food, but also as a raw material to produce other foods, then if the quality that is needed is high or higher, then it will motivate the farmers to get into that. And of course, I mean, this is one part of the equation. But in enhancing the standards of quality that is needed for the crops, I think will help to get the farmers in looking into better technology, but also the educational part that is needed.
Thank you.
Hi there, Amar Ali, CEO Africa Improved Foods. I'm interested in the question of protein and how in the future Africa should or could evolve its agriculture with respect to protein sources. So we know that meat is relatively inefficient in terms of land use, water use, but so you know, should we be focusing more on dairy, on poultry, fish, or is it really into pulses or other forms of protein that we need to go? Interested to hear the panel's views on that.
Any views? It's a really technical question, perhaps.
I think it's a question of consumption and consumption habits, right? As you evolve in what you consume, you have to ultimately end up with the best source of protein, and the best source of protein happens to be meat derived. But however, behind that is the requirement of grains again, right? Because to produce 1 kilo of beef, you need 10 kilos of corn. And likewise, if you want to produce 1 kilo of chicken, you got to produce 2 kilos of corn again. So it's a fundamental cyclical factor, right? So you have to ensure that there's enough raw production such that we can, of carbohydrates or starch, that is then utilized for the production of protein. And at this point in time, across Africa, we see a lot of importation of protein, purely because Brazil makes it far more cheaper than anyone else in the world, and Africa struggles to compete with that industry there. And perhaps Adade can jump in here and give us
the Brazilian
stuff. I think if you look in the evolution, and of course, I mean, you mentioned the different quality of protein, but I think before we fly, we need to walk. And I think the overall situation within the continent, majority speaking, is that, I mean, we need first to have the basics in place. And then you can start to talk about what is the next step when it comes to quality. But before having that, I think we are still at the point we are discussing the existing protein. Yeah, this was the whole discussion of the panel here, how we can improve the quality of the existing protein. And once we have that, then I think we can think about, I mean, how we move to the different quality protein. It's just taking the example, as you correctly mentioned, if you take examples of other countries like Brazil, it has been exactly the same. If you look at the history, I mean, there was a time that the quality of the crops were not good, and then it has evolved, and because of that, then it can develop and have the famous topic about yield, how much, what is the amount that you need from protein coming from corn and soya in order to produce meat. But this I think, I mean, is the next step in the overall development.
Sure. Before I take it back to the audience, the issue of cost comes up again. The reality is that there are producers elsewhere in the world who can produce food at a much cheaper rate than African producers. I mean, what can we do about this? How can we really challenge the costs? How can we work with governments and private sectors to look at certain things which make it really expensive to produce? Because you cannot then effectively compete with an imported good.
Yeah, look, I think the issue of competitive advantage arises for many reasons. You know, take the rice value chain, for example. You know, a number of countries in West Africa are spending in excess of $500 million a year importing rice, which is a staple, which is, a tragedy given, the fact that they have the land, they have the ability to produce. But it will take generations for them to compete competitively with producers in Asia and other countries that have been producing rice for generations.
So William, yesterday I heard President Kikwete talk about Vietnam, which started producing rice, I think, after their war in 1986. That was not too long ago.
I was actually coming to that. I think that it's a combination of things. So, like I said, competitive advantage arises out of a number of things. So, for example, it can come from having produced over time and taken the learnings and invested in the infrastructure that gives you the competitive advantage. But then you have countries like Vietnam that take a view that we are going to put in place the investment, the infrastructure, and most importantly, the enabling policies to get to a goal within a given time frame. And then get all the actors along the value chain, investors, government, most importantly, to invest smartly to get you to the goal that you want to get to. So there are a number of ways of doing it. Now, I think that there are a number of countries that are very vulnerable in West Africa, particularly in the rice value chain, as the available rice for export in Asia begins to decline, and they are going to be forced to have to develop their rice value chains for self-sufficiency. So it is indeed my hope that this will spur them. You need a number of things. You need private sector investment, certainly. You need public sector investment in infrastructure. but you also need the policies. I mean, there is no way you are going to build a sustainable rice value chain whilst you still allow free imports.
Exactly.
Because at the beginning, you are going to be producing at a higher cost. Your farmers are going to be producing at a higher cost. So, it's going to be a trade-off. You will have to put in place some policies that protect the farmers either from an import perspective or a subsidy perspective in the value chain. So it really has to be all the levers playing together to give you the competitive advantage.
And I think that's a really good point, driving it home, actually, because I think we have all the players need to be focused on this singular goal.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, we will continue to be an importer.
Absolutely.
Thank you. The lady up front.
Sorry, Ed Stoddard. Ed Stoddard. I'm a journalist with the Reuters news agency in Johannesburg. I was just wondering, El Nino looks like it's going to reform later this year. It hasn't come back reformed so quickly in about 50 years. The one that ended last year was quite devastating to agriculture on the continent. And I was just wondering what can be done to mitigate that in the view of the panel. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe I can try. Yeah, I think that since agriculture has been there, the issues of shocks are something that has also been there and are becoming sometimes more frequent, sometimes even more violent. And one thing that we can say is for sure is that we don't know when, but we know that many shocks will come in. So I think that one of the really very important thing is how we are investing in building the resilience of farmers and agriculture. Here in Africa, for instance, there are a number of instruments that have been put in place, particularly around at the state level, but also at farmer level, risk pooling instruments and insurance. One of the things, for instance, that is existing is the Africa Risk Capacity, which is a specialized agency of the African Union, which provides insurance against these extreme weather events, where countries cannot just take insurance by paying a premium, but also what makes it very important is it goes along with also building contingency plans to make to create the preparedness that will make them more efficient in case of actually an event and countries get payment. They already know where and how these payments should be used, where they should be used in the most efficient way. So it's not just about insurance, which is very important, but it's also about preparedness, contingency, and also building infrastructure that enable that kind of resilience. So that's one of the approaches.
If I may, just to build on that, 2 points. I think, there are things that we simply cannot tackle, but it can minimize. And to minimize is technology. This is 1 point. The second one is that how do we in Africa as a region tackle that? Because normally the impact is higher in one region than in the other. And how do we then make sure that from a regional perspective we can trade from the different countries within the continent in order to minimize the impact, and not always having this situation where the first reaction is that let's import material from other parts of the world. So very important would be, how do we as a regional basis can coordinate these activities and see the less impacted regions can support the most impacted regions.
Thank you.
My name is Pamela from TechnoServe. I think that generally we have a good understanding of what the challenges are, and there's lots of effort being made to address the efforts. My frustration is around execution, and I think in these panels we don't get enough of a sense of what is actually happening in terms of execution. So a follow-through, case studies, would be useful. Specifically, I wanted to talk to Grow Africa. I think under the Obama administration, there were some LOIs made by the private sector in partnership with the public sector, huge sums of money, and we expected to see huge investment in agriculture immediately. I think it's a couple of years down the road, and it would be interesting to hear from you, what the quantum of the investment commitment was, and where we are, and what impact we have seen in Africa as a result of that partnership. Thank you.
I was going to say, I think we have some pretty good case studies up here. With Royal DSM in Rwanda, there's an excellent case study around partnerships working together. So that's a good one, yeah.
Yeah, I think, just to reinforce the message I mentioned before, it's not that we are already there. There's a reason I cannot come back and tell you many years back. We have just started with the overall production. I think we have high quality capacity installed in Rwanda. I want to reemphasize again, local for local, the whole supply chain, the whole ecosystem. And it does not come for free. I think that the investment made by DSM and our partners is quite sizable. And with that, we are tackling from A to Z. Yeah, we have just started. Our operation started December last year, so we are facing now even more challenges. But I think resilience is one of the most important topics that we need to have, and we need to have the support, and the work together comes also in place. We cannot expect it only the private sector. It has to be a combination, private sector, but together with public sector, the civil society. We need to do this together, and the resilience is very important. We were mentioning before this panel has started, there has been so many pilots within the region, and these pilots come and go. The word that differentiates what we're doing in Rwanda from the pilots is scalability. So this is sizable. We are doing something to stay. But of course, if we are not able to make this work in the next upcoming years, and you don't have the support from all the players that we need to have, it will be even more challenging. But we truly believe that this is one, I'm not saying but it's one of the models that is tangible, that can tackle the whole ecosystem from A to Z.
William, do you want to add on about Grow Africa?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for raising that question. I think, first of all, I want to agree with you that there is a level of frustration, I think, amongst all stakeholders in the agriculture space around the speed of implementation, and the fact that there are many plans, there are many pilots, but nothing is happening at scale. I think that is across the board. I'm hearing that from the private sector, I'm hearing that from government, and I'm hearing that from civil society. And all of us as Africans do feel that sense of frustration because of the potential that exists in this space. But let me answer you specifically about Grow Africa and some of the things you raised. So Grow Africa was established in 2012 with a goal of accelerating private sector investment in agriculture. In a space of just 3 years, Grow Africa had signed up commitments to invest of about $10 billion. So it demonstrated there was a very high interest in investing in agricultural value chains in Africa. Today, of that 10 billion, about 25% has been converted into actual commercial activity. Now, the LOIs you mentioned were letters of intent by private sector to government to say, essentially, if you commit to these policies, if you commit to invest in this infrastructure, I will commit to invest in these particular value chains, okay? And so it was an agreement in essence between the private sector and government to co-invest to create certain value chains and to advance these value chains. Now, so the obvious question is, why are we where we are, that we've converted 25%, which is, about $2.5 billion, which is not small money in anybody's books. I think but in terms of the need that is there, it can appear quite small. But the examples that exist are like the ones Adade talked about, individual investments in processing, in manufacturing, agribusiness value chains. So they do exist. But obviously, there is a need to accelerate this. The biggest challenge, obviously, has been the role of government to ensure that policies are put in place that create an enabling environment for these investments to take place, but also investing in in infrastructure that supports agriculture. You know, we often, when the word infrastructure is mentioned, everybody in Africa thinks roads, thinks energy, because these are the things that are lacking in many of our lives. And certainly that is what the priority of government must be, to create these. But are there ways of making sure that as you invest your limited resources, that you're thinking about other things than just getting from point A to B? Are we thinking about markets, getting produce from one place to another? You know, one of the most expensive corridors to get agricultural produce is the Ouagadougou-Abidjan corridor. You know, you have surplus of horticulture in Burkina Faso that could be processed in Burkina Faso, transported to the port in Abidjan and exported all over the world. But you know, the cost of getting the processed finished goods to the port of Abidjan makes this produce uncompetitive. You know, we have private sector players that have shelved investments because they couldn't get the cost right. These are solvable problems. These are solvable problems, and they largely fall within the lap of government to solve these problems. Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire are in the same regional economic group. You know, they have formed a customs union. There shouldn't be an issue around costs. These are all non-tariff barriers that can be dealt with quite easily by senior leaders in government getting together and making the decision that they want to make this work. So, you know, with taking an integrated value chain approach, making sure that everything is working together, as we said, to create a policy that brings, you create objectives and you work together to achieve those objectives. I think that's the only way to do it. We've seen it done in Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries within a very short time, turning deficits into surpluses. But it does require a level of commitment, and government must lead.
I think, William, one point you've just brought up, which has just been raised, is the issue of sort of cross-border issues in Africa, which is also hamper, actually, the local production. And if that's not addressed, we will continue to have these problems as well.
Oh, no, for sure. There are many corridors in Africa that I can mention where you have surplus on one side of the border and deficit on the other. Same customs union, and yet because of non-tariff barriers, lack of investment in infrastructure, you continue to have this challenge.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone at the back, yeah? Thanks.
Yeah, hi, Martin Fisher from Kickstart, promoting smallholder irrigation across sub-Saharan Africa. I just wanted to ask about the sort of tension between turning a smallholder farmer into someone who can produce for a particular value chain, where they get 1 or 2 harvests per year, but they have a value chain to sell into, versus the goal of turning a smallholder farm into a full-time profitable business, where they get multiple different crops, diversification, livestock as well, and regular income on a weekly basis. And I think especially if we're talking about a number of things, certainly getting the youth to stay in agriculture, they want a regular income. They don't want to get it paid once or twice a year. And secondly, when we're talking about resilience, unless a farm can produce multiple different crops with, generally irrigation helps that a lot, but generally turning the farm, like I said, into a full-time business with multiple different crops. Because I hear so much emphasis on the value chains, which are important, but not the full picture for the smallholder farm themselves.
Sure. Can we get 2 more questions and then we'll close it? Sorry, guys. Get another question, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Dale Lewis, and I run a food processing company in Zambia. We've heard quite a bit about technology, and I suspect that we're referring primarily to sort of high-tech or high-level technology. I represent a lot of small-scale farmers that contribute a great deal of low-tech technology. I know we're all interested in climate mitigation and the role that farmers can play. And I have found, in my own work at least, that small-scale farmers are able to do so much for that top 6 inches of soil that keep us all fed, and also maintain an environment that's healthy. And I would be very interested in knowing from the panels and from the World Economic Forum, for that matter, what we can do to recognize and acknowledge the role of those farmers as opposed to the more commercial farmers that do need the high tech. But we sometimes overlook the low tech approaches to maintaining good, healthy farmland and soils.
Thanks. And just the last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah. Is there any? Foucault, yeah?
This lady, there's one there.
Foucault.
Sorry.
Thank you. Roger Powell, the Chief Agricultural Officer for Aldara Group. We farm 250,000 hectares over 5 continents. And in 5 countries in Africa, we've invested $500 million in Egypt. We farm 100,000 hectares in Egypt in places that cannot be farmed or deemed cannot be farmed. So there are success stories there, and these have been implemented over the last 2.5 years. A number of things have come out in the last 2 days, and that is cultural change, cultural shift. How are we going to do this? There's going to be a need for a paradigm shift between small farmers and commercial farmers. We're going to have to marry the two together. There's going to have to be trust. There's going to have to be a mentoring system, and there's going to have to be a technology and information flow between the two for us to succeed in changing this paradigm of food in Africa. Otherwise, in 10 years' time, we'll be sitting here and saying there is a disaster in Africa. So this needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so it looks like there are 2 questions. The first one relates to how do we push multiple incomes across for small-scale farmers and technology, how so for the small-scale farmers.
Yeah, look, I think I'll take Martin's question first, and there is no doubt that that is a desirable state, and Martin and his organization Kickstart are doing a wonderful job in small-scale farmer irrigation, which to me is just the biggest single opportunity I think that African agriculture has today. I think Peter just talked about a huge investment in Egypt on land that was deemed unfarmable. It's all based on irrigation. This is the one opportunity that I think many African governments do not see as low-hanging fruit when it actually is. It's much easier to do than it might appear, and the cost of particularly drip irrigation systems has come down considerably. So if there are any policymakers out there, this is the opportunity. There's no doubt about it. Having one of the biggest challenges, the last country that I was in was in Tanzania, speaking to the minister for agriculture, and he says the biggest single problem they have is seasonality. As being part of the same weather system throughout East Africa, his potatoes, his onions, his tomatoes are all harvested at the same time as every other country in the region. And there's only one solution to that. It is irrigation and making sure that you are able to produce throughout the year. So to me, Martin, spot on. It's a desirable state. But again, we have to have the policies in place that incentivize this sort of thing, the education, and then making these systems available.
Mm-hmm. And Bridget, in like 30 seconds, you want to answer the technology question?
Yeah, I think technology I think the question was between high tech and low tech, right? And from my understanding, low tech and what small scale farmers tend to do is come up with more innovative solutions. Whereas if somebody cannot afford fertilizer, they will use organic fertilizer. They'll come up with innovative structures to do that, because we've seen that personally. We've seen how they do it. Can we classify that as technology? It's a bit debatable, but I get your point. We shouldn't be talking about extreme high tech when we have to look at operating at a very grassroots level. So that point is well taken. I think just quickly, and a case study perhaps we should look at here is what the Land Bank has done in South Africa. And sitting next to you is our good friend TP, who's the CEO of Land Bank. And they've, over many years, transformed small-scale farmers into commercial farmers. So a success story in Africa, number one. And now they're engaged in a transformational agenda. And they're using, obviously, many tools, including technology, to do that. So I just wanted to highlight that as one of the success stories that we've had in Africa as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for this really lively discussion. I want to thank my panel. I think we could talk all day about the strategies. I think we will really also be keen next time to hear from one or two governments about what they are doing about policy, and also working hand in hand with private sector to push this very important agenda. So from me and the panel is to wish you a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.